It is 22:30 on December 19th, 1944, and a crossroads 8 miles northwest of Bastogne is about to become a slaughterhouse. Canvas tents glow faintly under a cold Ardennes sky, their sides stamped with the unmistakable red cross of a field hospital. Inside, wounded paratroopers lie on stretchers, half asleep under wool blankets, unaware that a column of German armored cars and half-tracks is grinding towards them out of the fog. The lead gunner does not see a hospital. He sees only shapes in the dark, and he opens fire. Tracer rounds tear through canvas. Stretcher cases, already broken by shell fire days earlier, are hit a second time as they lie helpless on the ground. Medics throw their own bodies over the wounded, and for a quarter of an hour the crossroads at Bois de Herbemont becomes indistinguishable from the front line these men were meant to be evacuated away from. 6 ambulances burn. The flames light up the Red Cross markings on the tents for the first time, visible now to the very gunners who had been firing on them. Then, astonishingly, the shooting stops. At the head of the German column stood a 30-something reconnaissance officer named Eberhard Stephan, a major who had already fought his way across the Eastern Front before being thrown into the last great German offensive in the West. In the space of a few minutes, Stephan's men had shattered the only second-echelon medical unit belonging to the American 101st Airborne Division, capturing well over 100 doctors, medics, and patients along with a field hospital's worth of equipment. He had every tactical justification, by the brutal logic of that offensive, to keep moving and let his prisoners fend for themselves in the freezing dark. He did not. Within half an hour of the guns falling silent, Stephan gave his stunned captives 30 minutes to gather their wounded, load whatever vehicles still ran, and follow his column back towards German lines. It was not mercy dressed up as legend. It was a battlefield decision, made in the confusion of a single winter night, that meant well over 100 men would survive the Battle of the Bulge as prisoners of war, rather than as bodies left beside a burning tent. That decision, and the strange, largely forgotten story behind it, is why the crossroads at Herbemont still matters more than 80 years later. By December 1944, the American army fighting its way toward Germany had become a victim of its own speed. Since breaking out of Normandy in July, Allied forces had advanced faster than their supply lines could follow, and by autumn, the shortages were severe enough to force hard choices about fuel, ammunition, and manpower. General Dwight Eisenhower's staff needed somewhere to rest exhausted divisions and blood-green ones, and they settled on the Ardennes, a heavily wooded, hilly stretch of Belgium and Luxembourg that Allied planners considered too difficult for a major German offensive. It was known among American soldiers, with a certain dark humor, as the honeymoon sector. Only 4 divisions, some battered from the Hurtgen forest, others entirely new to combat, held an 80-mile front. It was exactly the gap Adolf Hitler had been waiting for. Reeling from the failed assassination attempt against him that summer, and increasingly convinced that a single dramatic stroke could still split the Western Allies and force a negotiated peace, Hitler ordered 30 divisions into the Ardennes for what would become the largest single battle the United States Army has ever fought. More than 500,000 American troops would eventually be drawn into the fighting, against roughly 1 million men on both sides combined. 19,000 Americans would be killed, close to 50,000 wounded, and over 23,000 captured or reported missing before the offensive was finally halted in late January 1945. For the medical services attached to the American divisions caught in the opening days of the attack, the problem was not simply the scale of the German assault, but its speed and its unpredictability. Field hospitals and clearing stations were designed to sit safely behind the front line, close enough to receive casualties quickly, but far enough back to avoid direct combat. The 101st Airborne Division's own second-echelon facility, the 326th Airborne Medical Company, was a lean outfit of only around 200 officers and men, built to fold into gliders and deploy quickly rather than to defend itself. Its personnel carried no weapons at all, in strict compliance with the Geneva Convention's protections for medical units, and its tents were marked deliberately and visibly with the Red Cross symbol that was supposed to guarantee their safety under the laws of war. That guarantee depended entirely on the enemy being able to see the markings before opening fire, and on darkness, fog, panic, and the sheer velocity of a panzer breakthrough. That assumption collapsed almost immediately once German forces bypassed Bastogne to the north on December 19th. Nobody in the American chain of command believed a mechanized German column could reach a crossroads 8 miles behind what they still considered their own rear area. They were wrong, and the wounded and the medics who treated them paid the price for that miscalculation before the night was through. The equipment involved in this story was, by the standards of 1944 combat medicine, remarkably small and remarkably fragile. A division clearing station of the 326th type could be erected in roughly 2 hours by a team working in darkness and cold, a canvas complex of treatment tents, ward tents, and a headquarters tent, each one lit by hurricane lamps and heated, when fuel allowed, by small portable stoves barely larger than a modern camping heater. Because every item had to be capable of fitting inside a CG-4A glider, a wood and fabric aircraft roughly the length of 2 double-decker buses, the unit's vehicles were mostly stripped-down jeeps fitted with litter racks bolted across the rear seats, each one able to carry 2 stretcher cases at a time over broken ground where a full-sized ambulance would simply become stuck. It was an ingenious solution to the particular problem of airborne warfare, light enough to be dropped behind enemy lines, yet it left the unit with almost no means of self-defense and no armor whatsoever, a deliberate trade-off under the Geneva Convention that assumed, correctly in the vast majority of engagements, that a marked medical unit would not be deliberately targeted. The company's most valuable asset was not a piece of equipment at all, but the 4 trauma surgeons of the 3rd Auxiliary Surgical Group attached to it, physicians trained to perform procedures no ordinary battalion aid station could attempt, closing chest wounds, controlling internal bleeding, amputating shattered limbs before infection set in, working under a single bare bulb or a hurricane lamp, using instruments sterilized in boiling water over a field stove. These surgeons could keep a critically wounded man alive long enough to survive the bone-jarring journey to a proper hospital further to the rear, a journey that, in the deep snow and ruined roads of the Ardennes that December, could take hours rather than the minutes such cases needed. It was this combination, mobility, minimal footprint, and genuine surgical capability that made the 326th Airborne Medical Company so difficult to replace once it vanished into German hands on the night of December 19th. The unit at the center of the story, the 326th Airborne Medical Company, had already earned its reputation the hard way, treating hundreds of casualties on the beaches of Normandy and during the brutal 72-day campaign in the Netherlands that followed Operation Market Garden. Commanded by Major William Barfield, with roughly 220 officers and men on its books, the company was built around 3 platoons, a headquarters section, and a small medical supply team, all of it designed to be light enough to fit inside CG-4A cargo gliders. Attached to the unit was a specialist surgical team from the 3rd Auxiliary Surgical Group, led by Major Albert Crandall, 4 trauma-trained doctors capable of performing emergency operations that the 326th's own medics were not equipped to carry out. On December 17th, with German forces already tearing into the 1st Army's lines further north, the Screaming Eagles were ordered out of their rest camp at Mourmelon, France, and into Belgium. The 326th convoy of jeep ambulances and borrowed cargo trucks made an all-night drive, arriving at their designated clearing station site, a road junction on the Bastogne to Marche Road, at 10 o'clock the following morning. It was Division Surgeon Lieutenant Colonel David Gold and Logistics Officer Lieutenant Colonel Carl Coles who had chosen the spot the previous evening, reasoning that a position 8 miles from Bastogne itself was about as safe from enemy action as anyone could reasonably expect. It was a defensible judgment based on the intelligence available at the time. It also turned out to be almost exactly the route a German reconnaissance battalion needed to reach an intact bridge over the Orthe River. By the following afternoon, the clearing station's tents were up, its Red Cross markings clearly displayed, and casualties were already arriving from the fighting raging around the village of Novelle, a few miles to the northeast, where American armor and paratroopers were locked in a desperate delaying action. One of the men brought in that afternoon was Major William Desabry of the 10th Armored Division, gravely wounded by shell fire and rushed into emergency surgery, then left sedated in a ward tent to await evacuation, unaware of what was coming. By the following afternoon, the clearing station's tents were up, its Red Cross markings clearly displayed, and casualties were already arriving from the fighting raging around the village of Noville, a few miles to the northeast, where American armor and paratroopers were locked in a desperate delaying action. One of the men brought in that afternoon was Major William Desabry of the 10th Armored Division, gravely wounded by shell fire and rushed into emergency surgery, then left sedated in a ward tent to await evacuation, unaware of what was coming. Captain Willis McKee, one of the unit's doctors, had grown increasingly uneasy watching streams of panicked Belgian civilians pass the crossroads throughout the day, and drove into Bastogne that evening to ask permission to move the hospital closer to the town. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting division commander, told him not to worry. Barely 7 hours later, that reassurance proved fatally optimistic. The column responsible belonged to the reconnaissance battalion of the 116th Panzer Division, reinforced with a handful of heavy armored vehicles, an artillery battalion, and a rocket launcher battery, all under the command of Major Eberhard Stephan. His unit had spent 3 days probing through a gap torn in the American lines, and by mid-afternoon on December 19th was pushing west from the recently abandoned town of Houffalize towards a crossing point on the Orthe. Stephan's column had no idea an American hospital lay directly in its path until its lead vehicles stumbled onto the tent camp in the darkness. What followed was not a deliberate attack on a marked medical facility so much as a case of mistaken identity in appalling visibility, the kind of tragedy that battlefield confusion produces with grim regularity. It was the burning ambulances, ironically, that saved the situation from becoming a total massacre. As 6 vehicles caught fire after the initial burst of shooting, the flames threw enough light onto the hospital tents for German soldiers to finally make out the Red Cross symbols painted across them. One of the surgical team's officers, Captain Charles van Gorder, who happened to speak fluent German, shouted across the chaos that the camp held only medical personnel and unarmed wounded. Lieutenant Colonel Gold formally surrendered the position to Major Stephan soon afterwards. Rather than treat the captives as combatants to be dealt with harshly, Stephan gave them a strict but survivable ultimatum: 30 minutes to collect their wounded and equipment onto whatever trucks still ran, and then to fall in behind his column on the march back towards German lines. Under wartime conditions, with his own force still pushing hard for a river crossing and no obligation to slow down for prisoners, it was a remarkably measured response. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The scale of what had been lost only became clear the next morning. 11 officers and 119 enlisted men of the 326th Airborne Medical Company had surrendered that night, along with the surgical team's 4 doctors and 3 enlisted assistants and 5 members of the division surgeon's own office, Lieutenant Colonel Gold among them. One medic, Private Henry Sullivan, was killed outright, and an unknown number of the wounded already inside the hospital died in the initial burst of fire or in the fires that followed. A convoy of trucks driven by African-American soldiers, apparently unconnected to the medical company, blundered into the same ambush and was destroyed with similar losses. No full record of their identities has survived. In the chaos and looting that followed the surrender, several prisoners slipped away into the darkness, including 3 of the 326th's own captains, and made their way back to American lines by dawn. The rest, roughly 140 men in total, began a long march into captivity, most of them ending up in prisoner of war camps deep inside Germany, where survivors later described surviving on rutabagas, sugar beets, and bread baked with sawdust until liberation came the following spring. What Stefan's restraint did not do, and it is worth being honest about this, was save the hospital as an institution. The clearing station itself was destroyed, its equipment looted or wrecked, and the 101st Airborne Division was left at the worst possible moment of the entire siege of Bastogne, without its only dedicated surgical facility. What his decision did preserve was the lives of the men inside it. Compare Herbeimont with what happened just 3 days earlier and a few miles to the northeast, at the crossroads village of Malmedy, where soldiers from the 1st SS Panzer Division machine-gunned roughly 84 disarmed American prisoners in a snow-covered field, and increasingly starved of the fuel, aircraft, and printing capacity needed to keep aerial reconnaissance and reproduction running at pace once Allied air superiority took hold over Western Europe from 1944 onward. There is a certain irony in the fact that the very German maps produced to support a war of conquest, detailed surveys of resources and terrain across occupied Poland, the Baltic states, and the Soviet borderlands, became, once seized by advancing American and British forces, some of the most valuable cartographic material the Allies possessed. Small, unglamorous teams of American librarians, archivists, and intelligence officers followed just behind the front lines specifically to locate and secure these captured collections before retreating German units could destroy them, working alongside the same organizational apparatus that had built the Army Map Service in the first place. That captured material would go on to underpin American strategic mapping through the opening years of the Cold War, when much of Eastern Europe was otherwise closed to Western reconnaissance, and it was only by the mid-1950s that the Army Map Service began transferring these German-origin maps out to research libraries across the United States, where many collections remain today. The map, once again, outlived the war that had demanded its creation, and outlived, too, the regime that had originally ordered it drawn. Assessing the precise operational impact of this effort is not straightforward, and honesty demands acknowledging where the record runs thin. Casualty figures do not exist for lives saved by an accurate beach obstacle diagram or a correctly marked river ford. What survives instead is circumstantial but persuasive. After-action reports from engineer units praising the accuracy of terrain intelligence during the breakout from Normandy, commanders' memoirs crediting detailed mapping with allowing rapid armored advances across unfamiliar ground, and the simple institutional fact that demand for AMS products only grew as the war progressed, rather than diminishing as commanders learned to distrust what they were handed. What can be said with confidence is that the psychological effect on planning staff, the confidence that came from working with current, detailed, reliable terrain intelligence rather than a pre-war civilian atlas, was itself a form of force multiplication, allowing operations to be planned with a precision that would otherwise have been impossible. The legacy of this wartime mapping effort reached far beyond 1945. The organizational lessons learned about integrating aerial photography with rapid mass production, about coordinating field survey units directly with combat formations, became the template for military cartography through the Cold War and beyond, eventually evolving through several successor agencies into today's National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Surviving examples of the wartime maps themselves, including original sheets from the Normandy landings and captured German cartography seized during the advance across Europe, are preserved today in institutions such as the United States National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and the Library of Congress's Geography and Map Division in Washington, alongside university collections that have digitized tens of thousands of individual sheets for public research. If you know where to look, you can still trace the exact contour lines that guided a landing craft towards a beach in Normandy more than 80 years ago. Return, for a moment, to that landing craft in the dark, to the officer with the torch between his teeth and the soft, worn creases in his map. He has no idea of the scale of what put that paper in his hand. The librarians tracking down decades-old French cadastral surveys, the photogrammetrists squinting through stereoscopes at grainy aerial photographs, the printers running lithographic presses through the night, the field surveyors who would, within days, be updating this very sheet under fire as roads changed and bridges fell. He knows only that the paper is accurate, or he trusts that it is, and that trust is itself the product of an industrial and intellectual effort as vast in its way as the production of the tanks and aircraft that will follow him ashore. There was no medal for the man who corrected a contour line at 3 in the morning. There was no memorial built for the woman who traced a river's true course from a captured German survey. Their names do not appear on the rolls of famous units, their work does not feature in the popular telling of the war, and their instruments, drafting tables, stereoscopes, and lithographic stones, gather dust in archives rather than museums built for public wonder. And yet, nearly 1 billion pieces of paper crossed the Atlantic and the Channel because of them, each one a small,